one more question again. There's a question for me about Belarus. Is there any possibility for the West how to relieve the Belarus, how to make Belarus more democratic? Is there any kind of strategy that make, because here on the University of Warsaw we have many students from Belarus. They are open-minded, but how to make Belarus more democratic, less Russian, but more European?
Well, what I say to my Polish friends when we have this discussion is, welcome to our side of the line. Now you know exactly the kinds of problems we faced dealing with Europe during the Cold War. How do you do something that seems impossible? And I guess the way you do it is to be patient, but also determined. In policymaking, you have to be realistic about what is possible in any given year and at any given moment. But don't elevate realism to the status of a doctrine. Because when you do that, you usually write off countries. It's impossible. The Iron Curtain will never fall. The Berlin Wall is there forever. Be realistic. If we elevated realism to a doctrine, we never would have supported solidarity. But if you try to do too much too soon, you'll fail. So work with Belarus, be patient, be determined, do the work to help Belarus, and wait for better times, because those times may come, and then you'll be ready. That's not a satisfying answer, but you know, sometimes you just have to stick to it and be patient.
Professor Teimuras Babaskiri from Tbilisi State University, Georgia. Mr. Fried, you have several times mentioned today that Russia has invaded Ukraine, but I was looking for also that you would add Georgia also to the list of the invasion, of Russian invasion. And I have just one question in this case, whether you gave an interview to Georgian station and said that I do not think that even after the Russian-Georgian war we realized how seriously Russia was going to use force to stop the accession of its neighbors and institutions of free world. When the situation in Crimea was quickly deteriorating, when the Russians were deploying the troops hiddenly, like they did in Georgia in 2008. Why did the American administration did not think that it was the beginning of new full-scale invasion? Why?
Sure. Well, I won't forget the Russo-Georgian War. I was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs during the war. I was with Condi Rice in Tbilisi when President Saakashvili signed the 6-point ceasefire. So I remember that. What we succeeded in doing for Georgia is supporting the economy after the war so the country wouldn't collapse.
The question was different.
I know. In Ukraine, the collapse of the Yanukovych regime occurred very quickly and without warning. He fled. He took off. And the Russians moved their forces, the little green men, into Crimea, or out of their bases, into Crimea, and took over within days. the new Ukrainian government was barely able to function. They were just finding their offices. There was not time to react. After the Russo-Georgian War, the Bush administration ended, right? That was in 2008. The Obama administration came in, and we were in the territory of the reset with Russia. I'm not doing this to defend or criticize. I'm just giving you, I'm trying to answer your question historically, like what actually happened. And the Obama administration tried to deal with Russia on a constructive basis and also failed. So the question is, will the Trump administration learn from the failure of the Obama administration and the Bush administration and not make the same mistakes? Now that's a good question. I would say this: the Trump administration has confirmed the Warsaw Summit decisions for troops, NATO troops and US troops in Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania. As a Georgian, you might say, what about us? I have some sympathy for that position. But I would say this: the rest of Georgia, unoccupied Georgia, is still free. The Russians probably expected Georgia to collapse after the war, and you didn't, which means you're still alive, which means there is still hope. And one of the things we need to do is to prevent the Russians from conquering more countries and resist it, and prepare additional sanctions. My last job in government, before I retired last April, was the sanctions coordinator for the State Department, and I had it fell to me to negotiate the sanctions against Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. The Russians know that we and the Europeans had prepared additional sanctions if they resumed their aggression in a major way. Hopefully, the Trump administration will not let that preparation go to waste. So we have something to work with. And that's what I would advise the Georgian government and what I've said to them. Now, there we are. Your country is still alive. And we all have work to do. Probably not satisfactory answer, but then again, it's not a satisfactory situation. But it could be worse. Georgia is still alive.
Hello, Roman Kachurka, University of Warsaw. Actually, I'm from Belarus, and I have two controversial questions. The first, what do you think, is there any difference between patriotism and nationalism?
Yeah.
And the second one, on this conference we speak a lot about democracy. Don't you think that populism is a main threat to democracy? Now we see a lot of populism in modern politics, a lot of radical and simplistic propositions to solve difficult problems, economic or demographic one. Now we limit voting right to people older than 80 years old, right? What do you think about limitation of voting right on the basis of education census, for example, or do you see any other ways to deal with populism in politics? Thank you.
All right, patriotism versus nationalism. Okay, in the Western tradition, Aristotle teaches us that each virtue has its corresponding vice, right? Courage has the corresponding vice of recklessness. Ambition has the corresponding vice of greed. Patriotism and nationalism are the plus and minus of the same thing. But Aristotle teaches us to focus on the good half and not the bad half. Patriotism is love of country. I guess nationalism means elevation of the nation above all other values. And that is not in the Western tradition. It's easier to express that principle than it is to carry it out in practice. Populism. Populism is a dirty word. It usually means demagoguery. But I would like to find a way to capture the positive side of populism, which means, I suppose, addressing the needs of people. Populism, properly understood, means a state of the rule of law, because people's needs will not be met if there is mass lawlessness or massive state-sponsored corruption or if institutions are weak. That's not populism, it's demagoguery. How this works out in individual countries is up to individual countries. But I don't want to surrender the notions of helping ordinary people live better lives. That's not easy. But I think it is the job of politicians to create a popular mandate for those values, like the rule of law. I admire President Macron's political campaign, and I contrast it with the campaign of Theresa May. She ran a cautious campaign, accepting the premise of the Brexit argument and softening the rough edges. Macron challenged French negative populism right up front, in their face, aggressively. He spoke in favor of Europe and he won, which shows that a bold, even populist campaign does not have to be anti-liberal in the proper sense. Each nation is different. I understand that. But I think the right job for a politician is to capture political support for a good agenda. And if you don't want to do that, why are you in politics? But easy to say, I'm not in politics. I've spent my career advising politicians. Anyway, it's up to all of us also who serve in government or advise governments to find ways to translate a politician's political interest into the best possible policies. That's a task for any of you who are going into government in the future.
I'm sorry for taking the floor for the third time, but maybe there's nothing else that want to take floor. There's a topic for all the Poles, and many of us are taking, beside us, all of students here on international relations and students of political sciences, Free Seas Initiative.
Yeah.
Yes? And is it a serious initiative for you? or this is just a rhetoric thing, or is there any chance that Free Seas initiative will be some kind of alternative for Russian and German cooperative in economics?
Well, the Three Seas Initiative, I'm now working with the Atlantic Council, and so full disclosure, the Atlantic Council supports and helped conceptualize the Three Seas Initiative, working with the Polish and Croatian governments. So the Three Seas Initiative deals with 3 pieces necessary to build Europe whole, free, and at peace. That is, energy independence and a network of pipelines to weaken Russian energy leverage over this part of Europe, transportation infrastructure. It all goes east-west, and it should also be north-south, and communications, internet connectivity. Now, those are worthy objectives, but those are also practical objectives. If the Three Seas Initiatives is seen as some kind of political construct to weaken the European Union, it will fail. That's not an idea that seems to me is worth pursuing. That is, why would Poland want to weaken the European Union in favor of countries between Germany and Russia? Historically, that doesn't work out very well. It does make sense, the Three Seas Initiative does make sense if it works with the European Union, with the Commission, and with international, and with business and banking to thicken the infrastructure of this part of the world to erase the difference between Europe east of Stalin's line and west of Stalin's line. That is a worthy objective. But it should be an objective in the name of an undivided Europe in an undivided West. So that's my understanding of the Three Seas Initiative. And as such, that is something I certainly support. And look, congratulations to Poland. You know, you got Donald Trump to a mini meeting of the Three Seas Summit. But to work, it needs to be seen as also pro-European, which is not impossible to do. It's not even that hard, but that's the one cautionary note I would make. And then push it.
Great.
Okay.
Dan, thank you very much.
Dziękuję.
Well, for 4 days, we've had something like 27 different meetings. The topics were all over the place. We talked a lot about security. We talked a lot about international politics. We explored things like whether Gazprom is being used as a political tool. We looked at young people and their attitudes in Ukraine. The number of topics that we covered is actually quite large. The best of those essays, the best of those presentations will wind up being published in something called the Warsaw East European Review, which, believe it or not, we published this on Monday. Today is Thursday, and it's almost out of print. So to be sure, we didn't print 50,000 copies, but still, it's gotten to be quite popular, and we expect that next year we're going to have another very good edition of this for students to take with them. You can pick one up on your way out if you haven't had one already. I suspect that the team that put this conference together is probably almost as worn out as we are. And now is probably a very good time to thank everybody for coming, for participating in lectures that may not always be your particular cup of tea. So I know that there are students who are in different fields of study for whom some of the things that we talked about are in left field. Well, that's okay. That helps you to become something of a Renaissance person. The more you know about the world, even if it's not in your particular field of interest, the better off you are. I would like to think that this conference gave everybody something to think about. We're already planning for next year's meeting, and in the meantime, I wish everybody would come to our reception, which is taking place just as soon as I finish, and I would like to declare this conference closed. Thank you very much.